This is getting out of hand. Now there are two of them.
The name alone is actually pretty spooky. Another monster. The idea that Johan wasn't the only one out there. But who is this other monster and where do they tie in to the story that we all know? Well, today we're going to answer that as we look at Naoki Urasawa's Another Monster. There's a lot in this book, and fair chunks of it are just interpretations of the events in the main series. We're going to pick out the choice cuts of new information to share here, including Tenma's favourite song, Johan's favourite book, but also some deeper ideas, like how a struggling communist party in Czechoslovakia helped Bonaparta consolidate power and turn from patricide to experimental despot. Also, there are new picture books like The Nameless Monster, so a lot to get stuck into. Let's go to the menu and get started. We're going to begin with the basics of the book and giving a little bit of background, what is it about, and so on. Then go through essentially the book's introduction, setting up the mystery and the idea of another monster out there. From there, a quick shotgun through some of the interesting points in the book, namely Tenma, Johan, Johan's mother, brainwashing, and the curse of Kinderheim graduates, which reveals a pretty tragic implication for our friend Grimmer. Then we can get stuck into some of the bigger ideas that this book goes through. These will be the political setup of Bonaparta's power, Bonaparta as one creepy dude, and the truth behind the second monster. We're going to finish up with the book's epilogue, and then a few thoughts on the book overall. Let's crack in.
But you know what the worst part of all is? I never learned to read!
Another Monster is a sequel novelization to Monster, published in 2002. It's written from the perspective of Werner Weber, an investigative journalist in the monster world who's looking into a strange murder case in November 2000. This leads him to looking into the Johan case that concluded 2 years prior, with the town's population left in ruins. It seems that whoever has organized this murder in 2000 has connections to what happened with this Johan character. So to understand this case, Weber needs to understand the Johan case. The book itself is set up like a report, with Weber laying out his thoughts and clues he receives over the course of his investigation. Most of these are interviews conducted with key characters from Monster: Eva Heinemann, Inspector Lunga, Rudy Gillen, etc. Each character reveals more about their own perspectives on what happened during the events of Monster. Coming directly from that series, this book contains a lot of overlapping information, which is why we're going to pick out some of the key new information Another Monster provides, rather than just following it straight through. About halfway through the investigation, Weber starts looking into the history of Czechoslovakia, from World War II to the Communist Party to the Velvet Revolution, and investigates deeper into Franz Bonaparta's history. Note that Bonaparta's real name is Klaus Pope, but for the sake of consistency, we're going to stick to calling him Bonaparta here. While the book does shine some new perspectives on the original series, the main bulk of new information regards Bonaparta, his experiments, and how he really was this monster. At the end, the story comes back to the original mystery, discovering who this other monster is, and has Bonaparta's experiments really stopped? With some context out of the way, let's get into this book.
Let's go!
Sir, there has been a murder, and you are a suspect.
Okay.
Austria, Salzburg, Nürnberg. A quiet neighbourhood on the 14th of November, year 2000. The setting was the St. Ursula Emergency Clinic, located on the north side of Market Square in the centre of town. It's 1:05 AM, and 4 staff are currently occupying the clinic. Dr. Ernst Lerner, intern Paul Hosch, nurse Rosemary Berg, and receptionist Hanna Ruplekter. A scream from reception. Rushing to the entrance, intern Hosch sees a large man wearing glasses, covered in blood. An emergency patient, perhaps? But then he sees receptionist Ruplekter on the ground, dead, and the bloody axe in the man's right hand. Hosch begins to run to the break room, but is bowled down by the man. When he gets back up, he sees Nurse Berg falling from the break room door, bleeding profusely from the head. This is when the night becomes hazy for Hosch. He somehow makes his way outside to a payphone and calls the police. At 1:54 AM, 2 police officers have arrived at the clinic. They see the horrible scene, with receptionist and nurse dead on a floor slick with blood. The officers proceed further to the break room, where they find Dr. Lerner near decapitated and a towering bloody man, axe in hand. The man turns to the officers. 1, 2, 3. My mission is complete. The man then raises the axe to his own neck and slices. Investigations began immediately, determining that this man was Gustav Kottmann, a serial killer that had fallen off the radar a year earlier. The question remains, however, why did he leave Hosh alive? And what could be the reason behind his final words? The investigation revealed that a man had come into the hospital a week prior, claiming that his sidearm had gone off accidentally, and he needed treatment for a bullet wound. The staff that treated him were the same 3 killed by the axe murderer but a week later. To further implicate this man, another murder had occurred in the town that was originally deemed a suicide. The victim was living under a fake identity, but was actually a significant figure in Czechoslovakia before the communist regime fell, a man who disappeared as new liberal parties ordered his arrest. Looking further into this man's death revealed darker secrets. He had been expertly bound and executed, the scene cleaned professionally to look like a suicide. Though what couldn't be hidden was some signs of a struggle. A struggle involving a gun the same day a mysterious man entered St. Ursula claiming a weapon malfunction. So who was this other killer? Weber posits that this other killer is the real mastermind, using Kottmann to cover his tracks. But now, this is sounding familiar. A hidden figure recruiting serial killers to do their bidding. This was beginning to remind Weber of a certain German case that closed a few years ago, the Johan case. And this is where Weber begins his journey into uncovering the deeper secrets of what happened during the mainline events of Monster.
Doing a lot of yammering, but unbeknownst to you, you're speaking your final words.
As mentioned earlier, we're going to kind of shotgun through some of these shorter but still interesting things that happen in the story, each progressively taking a little bit longer before we get into the real meat of what another monster holds. Heads up that this is going to be quite text heavy, as a lot of these sections are best done justice in Urasawa's own words. Oh, and I forgot to mention earlier, Tenma, Nina, and Johan, they do not appear as interviewed characters in this story, so we never hear anything from their perspective. Alrighty, let's go. The first set of interviews Weber does is to get more information on Dr. Tenma, interviewing various people who went to school with him back in Japan. What we get is really a short little biopic on Tenma's childhood. He was born to parents coming from previous marriages, with 2 older half-brothers from his father. The family was well off, running a successful busy hospital in the area, but the family itself was something that Tenma was seemingly distancing himself from. In school, Tenma was quite good at individual pursuits. It wasn't that he was bad at team activities, but it seemed like when he was working alone was when he was in his element. He studied well and was naturally gifted. He got accepted into a prestigious university, the first ever from his high school. He passed with flying colours. One day he caught himself reading reports by Dr. Udo Heinemann, the chief of Iceland Memorial, who was seemingly doing incredible work, so he decides to travel to Germany to work under him. See, back at home, Tenma's eldest brother went into banking and his other brother was struggling to pass his medical exams. The father looked to put the future of the Tenma medical practice on the shoulders of Kenzo. However, the mother urged him to give the practice to the second son. Quote, being Mr. Tenma's second wife, she was oddly enough extremely considerate and doting upon the 2 older, unrelated sons, and in contrast, incredibly harsh with her own flesh and blood, Kenzo. Eventually, the second son passed his exams and moved to a small town to doctor there, leaving the Tenma Run's hospital future unclear. It's said that the family has relented from pushing Kenzo into taking over the family business, and they still try to keep in contact. Weber concludes on Tenma, maybe Kenzo Tenma is some kind of stoic, the kind that bears everything over and over until the very end, when they snap and their personal sense of justice bursts forth. I believe that this could be a clue to understanding the mystery of why he decided to go off on his own to seek out and kill Johan. Besides this background rundown, we don't get any other information about Tenma or what he went on to do after the series. Oh, but we did get to learn his favourite song from Eva, Let's Stay Together by Al Green. If you want to listen, of course, there will be a link in the description. So this may or may not be a deal breaker to some folks. Another Monster gives us essentially the conclusive ending on Johan. Officially, he's still in a deep coma. As Inspector Lunga puts it, from the clues I believe it is appropriate to think of these crimes as being Johan's, but being comatose as he is, there is no way we can get testimony or admission of guilt. This is backed up by the fact that the Johan case became a pretty big deal. Rudy Gillen wrote a book about Johan which became a European bestseller. So if Johan had escaped, people would notice. Really quickly, I need to say I don't like this. One of my biggest sequel complaints is when they undermine the original source material. Giving Johan a canon ending removes a lot of what makes that original ending work, and I disagree with the idea of having the actual ending relegated off into a separate story. Thankfully, when discussing the idea of another monster out there, it's pointed out that there certainly can be, but Johan, he was something else, ensuring that this book doesn't sell Johan short as a dime a dozen. But if that monster is real, he is not like Johan. He was special, Inspector Lunga said. I asked him how they were different. The former detective answered, Johan possessed superhuman brainwashing abilities, but he also cast aside his desires one after the other. A rare type of criminal, like a Buddha drawn to destruction. I did not miss the first and only sign of fear that flashed across his face.
But wait! There's more!
Another monster gives us a unique look about how Johan brought down Kinderheim 511. We know that this orphanage was set up to teach kids how to kill with words. Eventually, the kids themselves managed to turn this around back on their instructors, sowing distrust and hate between the staff. And then, there was the fairy tale. In Kinderheim 511, there was a boy who was always kept under sleeping pills, because he held the words that could destroy any person. The teachers thought he was a monster and kept him locked underground. Such was the terror that they felt towards him that they swore they could see 10 horns and 7 heads. But one day, the boy developed resistance to the drugs and awakened. He manipulated his jailers and slipped back among the pupils. The boys didn't know who he was, because none of them knew each other's names or pasts. The boy hated everything about the facility, so he began secretly plotting to have everyone kill each other. First, he would steal all of their memories, so they couldn't even remember their own names, and then offer them the path to death through their torment. In the end, they couldn't trust each other, and the children and adults both turned upon one another. The boy who remembered this fairy tale said, everyone grew paranoid, frantic to find out who the monster was. But when he thought back on it, what? Originally, it was just one boy who told the fairy tale. A handsome boy with blonde hair. He was the one who started the whole thing. Why hadn't anyone noticed? Weber doesn't get the chance to interview the mother herself, but does investigate around the people who knew her in her university years. It opens up a lot more ideas about her character, considering the original really didn't give us that much to work with. The mother, we know, was studying genetics at Brno University. She had exceptionally good grades and seemed to study as if she was doing the workload of 2 people. Although she never graduated, completing everything but the graduation ceremony. It seems an instruction had come down from a government level to erase her records there, which obviously we can understand as Bonaparta clearing her past after abducting her for the eugenics experiment. We do get to learn a bit more about her life pre-experiment though. She worked in a nightclub singing, known to be able to mimic other singers particularly well. She also went by a few aliases. While the university knew her as Anna, her roommate knew her as Viera, and later she would reveal to a co-worker that her name was Marushka. This wasn't the only strangeness going on with her pre-experiments though. Her old roommate described that she had a past trauma regarding her twin sister that had never been born. During her mother's pregnancy, the doctor's verdict was that she could carry only one of the twins to term. So Viera, the mother, was born, and her sister died. So Viera never knew her younger sister. No. As she told the story, she got to know her sister in her mother's womb. But when she was born, her mother was deeply wounded by the death of her twin, and was always comparing Viera to her younger sister. Viera is Viera, but as a young girl, she lived with the fear that she herself might have killed her sister in the womb, and thought that her mother hated her for that. She would always say things like, I have to do my sister's share of studying, or I have to be happy in my sister's place. I think she felt like she had to do twice as much to live her life for 2 people. Do you have any other information about the twin sister who died? Well, once you hear this, you're going to think that she was a crazy woman, but she definitely wasn't. But sometimes Vieira had the delusion that her twin sister was in fact still alive somewhere. She said that her mother had given the child that died a name. The name of the twin who wasn't born was Anna. So this opens a lot of doors on the mother. Did she have a multiple personality? This is an idea commonly thrown around in the series, from understanding Johan's character when the gang are in the Turkish quarter, or even seeing how some of the brainwashing techniques are described. Again, we don't get a clear conclusion, so interpret this as you will. Secondly, it raises the idea of twin psychism, the strange connection that twins seem to have. The mother apparently getting to know her twin prior to being born. And perhaps that extends to her own children too. When Weber interviews Nina's old orphanage matron, did she ever do anything out of the ordinary? Well, like I just said, she would speak to herself. It was like she was relating the day's events to the wall. Probably to Johan, or... Were you just about to say something? Yes, but, well, it's just too outlandish to be... Anna would often tell me, Johan learned about this today, or Johan met this person. But I thought she was just imagining that. But there was one night she said, tomorrow, Johan's going to leave his orphanage. And the next day, Kinderheim 511 burned down, and only Johan and another boy made it out alive. I think that was just a coincidence though. One of the key skills that Weber is trying to understand through this book is how people like Johan or the other monster can brainwash serial killers into doing their bidding. During his interview with Inspector Lunga, Weber is asked to draw his home city of Vienna. While unable to get much down, Lunga notes that everyone always starts with their own home. From there, they draw out further and further from what they know, but always starting with their home as the center of the city, the center of their world. And this is how Lunga describes the brainwashing that people like Johan do. In the very center of your mind, just like this map, there lies the foundation of your ego, your identity. But suddenly, your coordinate axis is removed. There is no meaning to this center. There is a much more appropriate center for your heart. This is the reality of what we call brainwashing. He smiled. And when a human being's mental axis is removed and they are lost, you gently and carefully entrap them with words, not giving them the opportunity to think, offering them a new place to live. You will find that human beings follow the instructions of whoever furnishes them with this new home. They become surprisingly docile. Pair this with how Dr. Gillen describes multiple personality disorder. So, dissociative identity disorder is when there exist multiple personalities within one human mind. That's right, childhood abuse is often the chief cause as far as we know, but I like to use what I call the flashlight in a darkened room metaphor. The dark room represents the human heart. There are built-up emotions there, common to all of humanity. But the personality changes depending on where you shine the flashlight. If I move the point of light just a bit, I could become you. In the case of multiple personalities, the person doesn't like where their light is shining and wants to change himself, but doesn't have the courage to move his beam of light. So he just goes out and buys more flashlights and turns each of them on. This is where the multiple personalities come from. So the techniques that Johan has learned revolve around breaking the core identity of a person. One of these key pillars is a name. While not explored in this section of the book, it comes up in the discussion about Bonaparta as well as being a key component to the new picture books published. Heck, it's even a key idea in The Nameless Monster. How would he actually go about infiltrating the heart of another person? By acknowledging their worth, by never frowning upon their actions, and by teaching them that they are not alone in the world. They are elated, believing they have found their one true friend, the only person in the entire universe who understands them. Or, on the contrary, he might belittle them, lambasting their every move and driving them to the darkest pit of mental solitude and ruin. After doing that, he would simply make a little request. Just kill one measly person. That's all. Kinderheim is another one of those areas that, while vital to the series, we don't actually get much concrete information on. The first revelation that this book gives is Kinderheim wasn't so much a unique German project to create human weapons, as it was really a satellite location for what Bonaparta was doing. It was the same methodology. So we can really see what Bonaparta was doing in Kinderheim as one and the same. It was set up in the 60s, so it was running for a long time before it got shut down. One of the learning goals was to emulate Bonaparta's own prowess of controlling other people. Since we already know a bit about how the brainwashing works, here is what Kinderheim taught. To put it simply, you know how people are psychologically affected when you bring them up and then drop them down, or put them down before raising them up again. You start off by saying, "You're no good, you're a terrible person," and they'll panic and lose their identity, making them easily manipulated. You just don't want to face yourself head on. Depending on the circumstances, one might lose all self-confidence and end up committing suicide. But the activities at Kinderheim 511 were even more dangerous. They were taught that the greatest weapon one can wield against another person is not guns or strength, but words. They were trained to be specialists in manipulation. No, trained to be leaders. I think that what happened there was a game of survival, where words could kill, and those who lost were internally destroyed. It's interesting that Kinderheim was kind of set up as a reprogramming institute to create indestructible future leaders, and it's definitely described as a prison-like place for the kids. But some of the students can and did get kicked out of Kinderheim if they weren't suited for the programming. When describing some of these rejected students, but they were all emotionless and shut off from everyone else. Their faces were continually frightened. The only human reactions we could see was when someone would begin reading a book aloud. Then they would scream and cover their ears. And what happened to them? Most of them died within a year. But I mentioned earlier that Kinderheim may have some tragic implications for Grimmer. This is alluded to in the main series, but I think it hits a lot harder in this book. Now, most of the names of people who went through these programs were lost, but we do have some snippets on those who attended. When Weber interviews Jan Suk about attendees of the Red Rose Mansion, yes, we still don't know what happened at that mansion. Out of all the members that attended, we barely managed to get 5 to agree to speak with us, and even they didn't remember anything that happened there. The one unsettling commonality, however, was that while each of them had normal jobs and were married, all except for one had their marriages end in disaster, and all for one had suffered the death of their children. Since Kinderheim followed the same methodology, it's likely that these outcomes can apply to their graduates too. Furthermore, we get a first-hand report about one of the last attendees of Bonaparta's reading club, a man under the alias Sobotka. Genuinely, it's quite tragic. Sobotka was only this proactive in recalling this nightmare of his because he felt that a personal family tragedy that he had experienced was rooted in the Red Rose Mansion. He married a co-worker when he was 25. She said that she was attracted to his hard work ethic. They had their first child when he was 27, but it died at just a year old. The cause of death was unknown. At 28, they had their second child. He prayed that this one would be raised healthy. When the boy was age 1, the same thing happened. The boy stopped eating and fell into critical condition. Sobotka rushed to the doctor and the son was barely saved. But still, the cause was a mystery. The doctor said it was as if the boy wanted to commit suicide. At this point, his wife revealed that she wanted to leave him. She said that their first child died because of him, and her answer to Sobotka's shocked query was that he didn't know how to love. He didn't know how to smile. "Have you ever seen your children smile?" she asked. "They're trying to kill themselves because they think you don't love them. And I don't want it to happen again." Sadly, this story sounds a bit familiar.
Hi, I'm John Green, this is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about World War II.
Okay, let's break into the big boys. I find Another Monster's biggest chunk of new information is all the new threads tying the pieces of Monster together, and a lot of them revolve around Bonaparta. Piecing together his history and his story in Another Monster is much like piecing Johan's together in Monster. It's told in drips and it's out of order. So now we're going to establish the context of his personal journey, and I mean the whole context. This is all information discussed in the book, and forewarning that most of this is based on real history, so I do apologize in advance for oversimplifying things and any historical inaccuracies. The tale begins in the lead up to World War II. One of the big goals of Germany at the time was creating Lebensraum, this idea of living space for the German people. Now, Germany and Czechoslovakia had this kind of dicey history with this area known as the Sudetenland. At the time, it was included in the Czechoslovakian border, but a lot of its inhabitants were known as Sudeten Germans. A number of these people were Nazi supporters and voted in favor of seceding from Czechoslovakia to join Germany. Eventually, Hitler came down and said, I'm taking the Sudetenland now, or I can come back with the army. This was before the actual war broke out, so the land was peacefully handed over to the Germans. I say peacefully, more or less. An estimated 200,000 Czech people were expelled from the land as it moved over to German occupation. At this time, a certain Sudeten German was against this whole Nazi movement. His name was Werner Pope, who lived in the Sudetenland with his wife and son Klaus Pope, aka Franz Bonaparta. After the Second Great War began, Werner became an activist against the fascist occupation. He supported the idea of Slavic independence and worked to overthrow the Nazis with the growing Eastern communist movement. Eventually, the war ends, and the Sudetenlands are returned back to Czechoslovakia. And this begins a mass expulsion of some 2.5 million Germans who were occupying that land. This includes the Sudeten Germans who were living there from before the war began. However, some about 225,000 Germans still remained. Some of these were allowed to remain by various means, like having been allies against the Nazis, like the Popes were, but also some tried to stay in the land just by hiding their German heritage. Ultimately, this created a huge bias against ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia, a racial divide that actively shut down most Germans from progressing anywhere in the country. Quick side note, remember Werderman, the lawyer, and how his dad was a spy? Well, this was why he was a spy. He was a Sudeten German expelled from his land and essentially acted as a spy as his only way to return to his home in the Sudetenland. Never really acting out of a political motive, he was just a man who wanted to get back to the place that he calls home. The story continues with Czechoslovakia succumbing to a communist takeover in 1948. While political motives were obviously present, Werner Pope also played an important role in advocating for the communist ideals. He was a man of great charisma and seemed to be able to manipulate people with ease. If he hadn't been German, I think he would have become president or prime minister. He was a formidable theorist and tactician, and was a gifted agitator. Besides being a pillar of the Czech Communist Party, I think he probably had a direct connection to Moscow. Armed uprising of the labor unions, rumors of terrorist threats, the neutralization of the military. I've always thought it was likely that Werner Pope was working in the shadows of the communist coup that made Gottwald prime minister in 1948. The previous president, President Benet, resigned, and within a month, the only remaining non-communist cabinet member, Masaryk, died under suspicious circumstances. From then on, it became a one-party system. The country was run by the communists. It was said that Pope planned and executed this entire string of events. Werner Pope commanded a lot of power for a time, supporting the communist regime more from the shadows than anything else. It was about this time that he became infatuated with a young girl from near his hometown, a girl young enough to be his own daughter. The problem arose that his son, Bonaparta, was also head over heels for the girl. Ultimately, neither get the girl, and she ends up with a handsome man from another village, though the damage was done between father and son, with a deep hatred instilled between them. Bonaparta had been studying, most likely psychology, and his thesis had been picked up by the government. He published some monumentally important psychiatric paper, and it was sent to the Internal Ministry and East German government. He announced that he would change his storybook method to an innovative new educational style. After that point, his personality changed, and he became cold, haughty, and self-assured. His art and voice kept improving, but there was always this hidden hint of unpleasantness about it. Around now, his father Werner dies, and Bonaparta rises to become a powerhouse in the Czechoslovakian political world. He was protected on all sides by members of the party, military, internal ministry, and secret police. He was given very preferential special treatment for only being a lieutenant in the secret police. He was always well lubricated with funds and held many connections in East Germany. His power and influence seemed to grow and grow as the communist control of the country began to weaken. Bonaparta was tasked with interrogations of known anti-communist activists, who, after a short while with Bonaparta at the Red Rose Mansion, renounced all their original beliefs. And this was the power that the Communist Party was trying to own: the ability to control the minds of the people with words, ensure the survival of the system that they controlled. Bonaparta worked on this for the government in exchange for essentially a blank check to conduct whatever experiments he wanted. Karel Rank was one of these communist enforcers back during the regime. During his interview with Weber, Rank crisply unfolded his hands and placed them on the table. He gave a faint sigh. The Eastern system set up a fence around the entire East. As a result, our way of life and value systems differed quite a lot from Western capitalism. And what would happen if a genius with peculiar and obscure ambitions existed in that narrow space surrounded by fences? We officers with no power of imagination would rely on his talent, without considering right or wrong or common sense, no matter what unsightly result waited for us at the end of that choice.
Creeper, creeper. Oh man, creeper. Oh man.
Who is the real monster of Monster? How about the man who prints the blueprints of weapons that could destroy the world? The man who dehumanizes others to the point they're causing others to kill themselves? The man who turns 42 into 46 and thinks it's a kindness? Bonaparta is a creepy dude. How do you suppose Bonaparta became so powerful? As I said before, our choice was to prolong the system, particularly in 1977 when Václav Havel and his secret resistance group Charter 77 began activity. The government was on the verge of collapse. Even after we imprisoned Havel, all sorts of other firebrands like Marta Kubisova kept popping up. It was like playing a game of whack-a-mole. Then imagine that suddenly, a man appears with this magical ability to change people's personalities and what they think. And you can then imagine how the elite jumped at what he was offering. This minor pet project of certain party members that had been carefully raised since 1965 had now become a top-level project that was necessary for the continued survival of the old order of power. Earlier we mentioned that Bonaparte's father, Turner Pope, died without any further details. But remember that there had been bad blood between the two over the unnamed girl from the village. It turns out that Turner's death was a lot more vindictive than you'd expect. Pair a man with an expansive knowledge of how to dehumanize a person with a deep resentment, and you get what Bonaparta actually did. He used his father as his first experiment, annihilating the man's identity and leaving him for the rest of his life a confused mess. The son's hatred for his father, who had abandoned him and his mother, grew stronger. He had hit upon a method of destroying people by depriving them of their names, and he tested this on his father, who afterward spent the rest of his life in fear and confusion. His last years were said to be rather pitiful. He was such a sharp and talented person, but at the time of his death, he apparently was so confused that he couldn't remember his own name. It's returning to this idea of a person's name tying to their identity. In a way, what Bonaparta did to his father, if we think about some of the examples used previously, is that he turned off his father's flashlight, or at least moved it to a place where he couldn't remember who he was anymore. Names are central to Bonaparta's methodology, but he's even more sinister than that. Think about it. Bonaparta is a devil who steals the name of others, a genius at stripping memories away. How hard is it to imagine he could have found some new method that we could never think of? Another of his breakthroughs was how to make two people fall in love, something which he would use to manipulate the various people he pulled together for the eugenics experiment. His old book publisher, when first hearing about this new breakthrough, said, "I laughed," and told him he should put the storybooks behind him and sell his new manual to young people. He'd end up being the richest man in the world. And he told me, with a totally straight face, that it was only a method to make two other people fall in love, not to make someone fall in love with you. What's interesting is that Bonaparta primarily picked out women who were anti-communist for this experiment. Whether that's out of a political agenda or just the cruel joy of breaking someone's spirit, like he was doing in the Red Rose Mansion, we don't know. I don't believe that he was fascinated by genetics. He was more intrigued by how to recreate people who were already born. This is why I believe they only chose women who showed anti-governmental proclivities. I suppose he must have felt like some Greek god when those stubborn women fell under the spell of love, just as his formulas had shown. So the experiments continued, and this is when this little innocuous fact comes back into play. So we have this woman who rejected the Pope boys and had gone off to this other handsome bloke. Eventually, the pair have a son, and you might see where I'm going with this already. The son is a German Czech, and he wants to become a top-level soldier. However, the political climate is still very anti-German, so his chances aren't good. His mother thinks, I know someone who's a German Czech with a lot of political sway. I'll get in touch with Bonaparta. Meanwhile, Bonaparta has been scouting for the genetic best of the best to experiment with. And I'm sure you see where I'm going now. Bonaparta recognizes the beauty that runs in the family, helps the son get accepted, helps him advance, and one day calls in the son to return the favor. All he needs to do is go meet this beautiful girl who's studying genetics. Ultimately, it's not clear what becomes of the son, or should we say, Johan's dad. But the implication I get is that he gets killed. A cold revenge on Bonaparta's old love, and the beginning of isolating his new love. That wasn't uncommon for Bonaparta to clean up those people who got in the way of his life like this. From Carol Rank once again. He began gathering power in the mid-70s. That was when I started to wonder about his real identity. I began looking into his background and gathering information to find a weakness, until I decided partway in that I should leave him alone. It became clear that if I persisted in my course, I would be erased. After that, I simply looked the other way. I pushed it out of my mind and made an effort never to bring it back up. I'll be honest, I was afraid of him too. So Bonaparta was falling in love with the mother over the course of this experiment. We know this from the main series. But what isn't explored as much is that he was doing the same thing with her that we see Johan do, cutting her off from everyone who knew who she was. At some point, Bonaparta fell in love with her. I believe this is why he pursued her so persistently when she escaped the facility. His way of loving her was to take her name away, erase her memory, and become the only person in the world who recognized her for who she was. This sounds just like Johan. Stealing one's name, or to be the only person who knows one's name. Just as knowing one's true name gives the knower power over one's life, rendering you impervious to one's magic. This concept of the name being the true source of one's nature is commonly found in myths and legends the world over. This is why ancient peoples were said to only use their true name among the family and go by aliases elsewhere. The first time I read a scene in a fantasy novel with a magician scheming to find another's true name, I thought it was silly. But seeing the way Bonaparta brainwashed his victims, it makes you think it's not quite so silly after all. Jung said that myths are the expression of the human unconsciousness, and I think that if he lived today, he would point to this as proof. But obviously, we know that the plans for the mother didn't work out. The mother hated him with everything she had. At some point during this, he has some sort of epiphany, a realization of what he's been doing to people. By the time he takes Nina, he's made up his mind that he's releasing the family and starting fresh. From Bonaparta's publisher around this time. Suddenly, he told me that he never realized how painful it was to be hated. When I asked him what he did that someone would hate him, he told me that he stole their name. When you take their name, the person dies. He first tried this on his father. I thought, what a perfectly strange thing to say. He went on, almost as if he was talking to himself rather than me, saying, people who have their names taken away die in despair, and will accept any name you give them just so that does not happen. Anyone who could lose their name but still survive would be a true hero. Which is what ultimately leads him to freeing Nina after the massacre at the Red Rose Mansion. She remembered that back then, Bonaparta had let her escape from the Red Rose Mansion, run far away, Run as far away from here as you can, he told her. Human beings can become anything. He touched her cheek with his hand and continued, You are both beautiful jewels. That's why you must not become monsters. But this book pays attention to the amount of bodies that were found in the mansion. While 42 people died that night, 46 bodies were discovered, 2 of which were children. What had happened? Well, Bonaparta had got his right-hand man, Peter Chapek, to acquire the extra 4 bodies, essentially creating an alibi for both himself and Johan's family. They were officially dead. They could start again anywhere fresh. A final kindness for the women and children he had grown to care for. Where the mother went after this, who knows, but maybe she never got the letter that Bonaparta left for her. I've been watching you all this time, to eat up every bit of you. But instead, everything about you has devoured me. I wonder what I look like to you, who is collapsing into ruin. To which you left me, which is collapsing into ruin. You left me such beautiful jewels, the twins, who are like eternal life itself. The greatest sin is to take away a person's name. Reclaim your name, I return your name to you. Your name is Anna. I'm filled with sorrow now. Filled with sorrow. Filled with sorrow. Filled with sorrow.
Evil!
All I said was there's evil afoot.
Let's finally hit the titular issue, the second monster. In doing so, it's time to pull on all of those loose threads and bring them together.
But wait, there's more.
I mean, I would like to say that, but there's still a few threads that need opening before we can close off this other monster. Let's quickly refresh the memory. This man kills off a member of the previous communist regime, staging it as a suicide. During this, he takes a bullet wound and is treated at St. Ursula. The man recruits Kopman, the serial killer, to go and kill the 3 witnesses. The man's actions bear a lot of similarities to Johan, so let's figure out how they tie together. And we'll start with Johan's favorite book. When Weber interviews Carl Newman, he looks for any insider information on Johan that he can get. A particular piece that slips out is Johan's favorite book, Dawn in the Darkness, written by Fritz Weindler. Well, what's that about? The main character, Dawn, sells his soul to an evil sorcerer and gains dark powers in return. He uses these powers to exterminate evil in society, using a variety of merciless, brutal methods. In some of the books, an axe is used. But as he kills each wicked evildoer, that evil begins to bury itself in his soul, sending him on the path of crime. As one reads Dawn in the Darkness, it becomes apparent that despite not reaching the level of popular literature, it has a powerful and mysterious persuasiveness to it that justifies murder within the story. Another fan of the Dawn series was none other than Gustav Kottmann, someone who sent many a fan letter to this mysterious author. In fact, looking deeper into this book series, the artistry bears a striking resemblance to another author's style, Franz Bonaparte's. A note from Bonaparte's own publisher confirms the connection. He, Bonaparte, said that he read his books to a group of boys. I didn't really think much of it at the time, I just said, "Oh really, and how were the boys?" He said one of them wished to be a storybook author as well, a very bright and promising boy, and would I take a look at his work sometime? The publisher never did get in touch with that promising boy, but years later some new storybooks popped up that bared a striking resemblance to Bonaparte's own work. The Sleeping Monster and the Awakening Monster, written by Hermann Furr. The similarities in style and content can only give the conclusion that this Fritz Weindler and Hermann Furr were one in the same. Most likely, this was the promising student that graduated the Red Rose Mansion. The content itself entirely as uncomfortable as Bonaparte's own works. The Sleeping Monster by Hermann Furr. In ancient times, in an unknown place, it's told that all the people had their names taken away. They say that a rumor spread, a rumor of a monster who remembered everyone's names. And so many people left on a journey to look for the monster. They discovered a cave where the monster lived, but the all-important monster slept under a spell that had been cast upon it. Disappointed and exhausted from the long journey, the people fell deeply asleep in front of the cave. However, there they had a dream. In the dream, the monster came out and taught everyone their names, They awoke with great joy, grateful to the monster, and all returned to their own towns. However, now when they called out to each other by name, they found that all the names were lies, and they didn't even know who they themselves were. They began to hate each other, and they killed one another until there was no one left. So Herman Furr published books similar to what Bonaparta was doing, meaning that he was further teaching the ideas that he learned from the Red Rose Mansion in his books. And perhaps this spread further than what Furr had intended. When interviewing Furr's publisher, "What do you mean he had some fans?" Well, a large order came into the sales department for 1,000 copies of a gloomy book, all for one place. In this business, that's huge for a newcomer. But what were they going to do with 1,000 copies? I heard that marketing was told that they were needed for a reading seminar or something like that. I didn't understand what they meant, but I guess groups like that exist. A chill ran down my spine when I heard the words reading seminar. I nervously asked about the concept envisioned for the next book. Kina replied, "Well, the title was The Awakening Monster." I remember my body trembling. My intuition was not wrong. The other monster was lurking in Vienna. The second thread that Weber starts following in pursuit of Herman Furr is through Peter Chapek, Bonaparta's right-hand man. We know Chapek was complicit in Bonaparta's experiments and became a big player in this secret society, setting up Johan or Christoph as the next leader of Germany. At least, that was the intention during the events of Monster. But the timing wasn't quite right. It's rumored that Chapek and the baby wanted to conquer Germany. No, the world, or something like that, and to set up Johan as Führer. But I realized that Chapek had embraced such a plan since he first came to this town in 1989. But at that time, Johan was only 13 or so, and was it likely that they would hang their hopes on a mere child? In other words, although they had planned from the beginning to install a supreme ruler, wasn't it someone else? Milan probably thought so too, and if we assume that that someone was the author Herman Furr. So the original idea was to install Furr in the position that later they would try to put Johan into. The most likely way Chapek would know of Furr's ability is if they both came from the same place, the Red Rose Mansion. Likely he was also involved in some of Furr's missions from the government. While we don't get a lot of information about what these entail, we do get a particular case to look at. This brings to mind another case from the 50s, in which it's said all the people of a town slaughtered each other. The Great Massacre in Zweifelstadt, in the state of Niedersachsen. A rumor had swept the town that a man named Oswald was secretly a serial killer, and for the small town, news traveled fast. Surprisingly, the first murder occurred directly opposite Oswald's house on the north side of town. An auto mechanic named Volk Rogner mistook a visiting neighbor as Oswald and shot him with a handgun he owned for self-defense. That gunshot reverberated through the entire town, and in the confusion caused by Rogner's dreadful mistake, Bock shot the real Oswald. Oswald's wife then shot Bock, a house was set on fire, and one by one, people began to shoot at anyone who happened to come their way. The village was annihilated in a single night. But there is an epilogue to this event. It was reported that during the week prior to the incident, there was a graduate student who stayed in the village while studying folklore. Moreover, he was staying at a bed and breakfast in a private home, and told them something terrible was about to happen that night, and they were absolutely not to go outside to seek help until 2 days had passed. Also, it is interesting to note that this family, the only survivors in the village, had been repatriated from the Czech Sudetenland. At first, the police were not interested in the student's existence since he was not listed among the dead, but they became concerned when he suddenly disappeared from the scene, and an investigation revealed that there was no such graduate student registered under his name. Various theories have circulated regarding the true character of that man, but the prevailing opinion is that this was all an experiment conducted by an operative from the East Side. The final new thread to pull on Herman Furr is the truth behind this other murder that happened before the St. Ursula killings. The victim was a prior Czech leader in some regard, but who was he? The man's name was Eugen Molk, or his real name, Jaroslav Karek, part of the Czechoslovakian Foreign Trade Corporation, Omnipol. The corporation had ties to terrorist weapon dealings, and Karek himself was a top advisor on keeping liberalism suppressed in the country. As such a high advisor, he had connections to Bonaparta during the years of communist control. Was this the reason that Fur killed him? Was Carrick involved in organizing these missions like the one in Zweifelstadt? At the end of the book, Weber finally gets in contact with Hermann Fur. In Weber's empty hotel room, the phone rings. Picking it up, it's the voice of the man he's been seeking, and Weber's final interview takes place. This is where we get the final answers direct from the man himself. Hermann Fur was regarded as Franz Bonaparte's most outstanding student. After graduating the reading circle, he worked for the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. Eventually, he ran from his actions and his past to West Germany and became the author Fritz Weindler. In 1989, he was followed by Peter Chapek and he had to flee once again. Then, the mainline events of Monster happened. Fur happened to be around the Red Rose Mansion on the day when it burned down. Fur watched Johan, but no further contact was made between the two of them. 4 years ago, I went to Prague. Who knows why, but I wanted to set foot again in the scariest place, the Red Rose Mansion. But it was engulfed in flames. And then he emerged from within. I was set free. I stopped running. I could paint my picture books and live like him. I could hear the laughter in the man's voice. The end. In the landscape of the end, there will be only he and I. During this time, he was keeping in touch with Kottmann, should he ever need to use him. In 2000, Fur would kill Eugen Mulk, the last man who knew who he was. Johan had successfully got rid of Chapek and Bonaparte, so he was free once again, until an investigative journalist started tugging on loose threads. The interview ends with the following. The man whispered, "There's something I want you to see." I gathered my wits. What is it? The manuscript of my new work. I'll come over now. When? How soon will you get here? Now. Now? Where are you? In the room next to yours. A second journalist ends up finding Weber's notes in his room. Weber had disappeared without a trace, and no signs of Hermann Fur. All was quiet for the next 7 years, until 2008. A number of books from famous authors, Emil Schieb, Jacob Farabic, Klaus Pope, were all going up for auction. Curious, the journalist goes to the auction to find the books already sold to a man named Werner Weber. The journalist tracks down this man who seems to be waiting for him, but this man is clearly someone else, a half-German, half-Vietnamese who bared no resemblance to Weber. Was it your bid that won Helmuth Voss's sketches? That was a business transaction at a respectable second-hand book fair. Someone just asked me to put in a proxy bid for them. Is Werner Weber your real name? No. Why did you use that name? Just following orders? It wasn't someone's name you'd heard before? Nope, never. But the client did say it was kind of a joke, that if I used that name, someone would definitely come looking for me. Someone would come looking for you? Well, here you are. Looks like I hit the jackpot. Please, tell me as much as you can. Was your client Czech or German? Maybe neither. You can't give me more of a hint? I was shocked to see them on a TV news program, sitting bold as brass right next to a very famous world leader. Who was it, this very famous world leader? You mean a politician, right? Well, that politician's a man whose true motives can't be easily read. But they say that sooner or later he'll build an empire and make himself a dictator. If a large nation falls to earth with powerful leadership, it can rise once again in the world, if the will of the people is strong. There are a lot of dark rumors, but even America can't touch him. Do you know who I mean now? They say Voss wasn't just a picture book author, but also a great scientist. They say he did harmful experiments on rebuilding personalities. My client's interest was piqued, and they requested that I investigate his achievements. Achievements? Don't you get it? They're redoing the experiment again, under the supervision of that leader they're so tight with. Do you know a novelist named Fritz Weindler or Hermann Fur? He's not famous like King, but in Austria he seems to have a good reputation among horror buffs as a writer. The client now says he wants to commission me to locate that author's original manuscripts. He said he'd like to get to know him, and intends to invite him back to his own country. He says he's the next generation Voss. Once he invites him, he'll gather the children to resume the experiment. I don't know exactly what he plans to do, and I don't want to know.
Thoughts.
I didn't find a place to put this in anywhere else, but my goodness, this story is just so well written. It jumps character to character, and I can't imagine how difficult this must have been, to have each character come across so genuinely as their character. How abrupt and high status Eva tries to be, the franticness of Lottie, or the subtle conversation steering in a battle of wits between Weber and Lunga. As a book, this comes across beautifully. I would say that having read Monster First is compulsory to read this through properly, because you can't really look at this book in isolation. I think that this book excels at what it's going for, to add new perspectives to the world of Monster and set up this grander narrative that the story takes place in. It weaves together the different elements from the original that can be so hard to grasp the whole context of. So many times reading this book, I've just broke out in a big grin saying, "Oh, Urasawa, you cheeky devil, you." If you're a Monster fan, I highly recommend this book. You could just kind of define it as a flavored lore book to the Monster world, but I think that would really do it an injustice. It's incredibly engaging and rolls with the high standard that Monster sets.
But see, you said there were 2 new picture books.
Yeah, I did. I ended up slapping them into their own video, which I will leave links to. Note that Urasawa himself says that they shouldn't be read before reading another Monster, so take that as you will. Rad, that's all from me today. Another Monster is really good. If you're a Monster fan, it's easily worth your time. This was just some of the big standouts for me, and trust me, there is still so much more packed into those pages. Much like Monster itself, I'm sure a different perspective reading it will pick out things that I didn't. I'm going to try and get some editing done on the Another Monster wiki. It's got a lot of gaps at the moment which I'd like to find the time to fill in, so if you're looking for some more Another Monster content between this video and the book itself, try checking that out. Anyways, thanks for watching. This has been CG, and I'll see you Gs in the next one.